Hi guys, it's Vin with Boris Effects, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to quickly and easily create this motion tracked lens flare effect inside of Vegas Pro 17. Okay, so here we are inside of Vegas Pro, and we're going to be using LensFlare 3D from Boris Effects. Now, one of the great things about LensFlare 3D is its built-in ability to quickly and intelligently work with the clip to create obscuration maps. Now, an obscuration map allows our lens flare to interact with the video clip, so that instead of floating in front of the scene, we can now insert it behind objects such as these trees. Now, before we get into recreating the shot from a moment ago, I want to take a moment to show you how this works. First off, I'm going to use the FX browser to select a preset. Now, if you're not familiar with the FX browser, this is where I can choose from dozens of professionally designed presets, each of which is fully customizable. Now, in terms of what preset I want to select, it doesn't really matter for this example, but I'm going to choose this one because it's a pretty dynamic flare that I think will help show off just how powerful obscuration can be. Now, to trigger obscuration, I'm going to select the pull down for the obscuration matte layer and select source. This is going to tell my lens flare to use the clip that it's been applied to as a map source. Now, if I apply my lens flare to a text layer or another stacked clip, it's only going to look at the layer that it's applied to. So if you want to reproduce what you see here, make sure that you've applied it to the correct footage. Now, with obscuration map layer selected, a couple of things happen. The first thing is that when I drag my flare around, it now blinks out whenever it passes by a tree. The obscuration map is generated based on the lighter and darker pixels, so as the flare passes from a light region to a darker area, for example these trees, its brightness is dimmed. It creates the illusion that the flare source is behind the trees, which is very cool. But you'll also notice that the color of the flare changed. It's now mostly white. This is because by default, the map obscuration is set to RGB blending. If I select Luma from my drop-down menu, my flare is now based on the brightness and Luma values. It's going to retain its color and grow brighter over lighter pixels and fade as it moves over darker pixels. At its default values, however, it's not going to be entirely convincing, as you can see that the flare is still partially visible over the trees. To fix this, I'm going to adjust my threshold a bit. Now, this increases and decreases the sensitivity of the map layer, and with just a few tweaks to the threshold, my flare now completely disappears behind the trees and reappears when I move it into an open area. Now, for something complicated like this, where you have lots of little branches, play around with the threshold to refine that sensitivity. But essentially, when it comes to obscuration, that's all there is to it. Continuum makes it really that simple. Okay, so now that we have the basics down, let's take a look at our clip of the woman in the forest. She's looking up at something here in these trees, and what I want to do is create a flare that disappears as the camera movement positions her in front of that flare. Now, using what we just learned, I can set my map obscuration to source and tweak that threshold to get a decent look. But here's the thing. I need a way of tracking my flare into the scene. The camera moves, and we need the flare to move with it. And I don't want to have to keyframe its movement. Not only is that going to be tedious, it's a ton of work for what will probably be a very poor result. So here's how we make that easy and look great. As with most filters in the Continuum suite of plugins, LensFlare 3D has Mocha planar tracking directly built into it to help drive its emitters. Let me show you what I mean by that. First off, what I want to do is come down here and open up the Mocha motion tracker. This has a few settings that we can look at in more detail in a bit, but the two important settings here are Apply to Light Source, which will assign all the tracking data that we're going to generate to the flare itself, and the Launch Mocha Tracker button, which will launch Mocha's user interface. Now, when it launches, I can see that I have two tracker options. Light Source, which is a visual representation of where my flare will be, and Light Source Search Area. I can position this search area anywhere I want, and it will tell Mocha to track the movement of every pixel within that area, and that's going to give us our motion track. Now, your first inclination may be to think that the tracker area should be the same as the light source. It makes sense. You want to track the movement of the scene, specifically where the flare is going to be. But here's the thing. The area I want my object in this case the flare, may not exactly be the best place to get a stable track. In this case, I know that my light source is going to pass behind her. So if I try to track that exact spot, the moment she moves into the search area, Mocha is going to get confused. Mocha has a lot of great features, and while it is possible to mask out our actress and then track behind her, why make things more complicated for yourself? Instead, understand that all we need is to be able to track movement. Any movement at all, as long as it matches the movement that we're looking for. So what that means is I'm not going to put the search somewhere, for example, like her back. Because of parallax, her movement in the scene is not going to match the movement of an object in the distance. But these branches over here? Well, they're a pretty close approximation of where I want my light source to be. So with that in mind, I'm going to place my light source point up here. And I'm going to set my search area way over here around these branches. Now as I track forward, I'm going to keep an eye on the search area. If it looks like it's coming to an edge or maybe something is going to block it, I'm just going to stop, reposition that search area, and then continue tracking. It doesn't matter if I move the search area mid-track because Mocha is calculating the overall motion of the scene. So when I'm done, I'm just going to save out. Now if I go over here and click Show Motion Path, you can see that I have a nice smooth motion and the flare is staying locked in position. If I need to make adjustments, I can use the offset X and Y, but by and large, just by doing that quick tracking, I have a really good stable track. Now again, I am going to want to move through frame by frame and adjust the threshold of my map obscuration so that the flare is obscured by her head. But for the most part, this is looking pretty great. Okay, so we've motion tracked our flare and adjusted things so it's obscured when it passes behind her, and you know that's pretty much the main technique used for this effect. All that's really left is to tweak the overall look of the flare itself. Now ultimately, I want you to experiment with the various settings and create something that is unique for you. But let's quickly take a look and break down how to start customizing this flare. First off, I want to launch the FX browser again, and this time I'm going to select a different preset. Let's go with White Star Flare with Light Fog. Now there's a couple of things here that we can customize, but I also want to take this moment to point out that in the FX browser, don't worry if when playing back your effect, it's not mapped to the tracking that we did earlier. The browser is there really just to preview an effect. When I apply back to Vegas, all of my tracking and obscuration data is going to stay locked in. Now I may have to tweak the threshold a bit since the flare intensity is going to be different, but this is a great way to try out different flares without having to redo everything every single time. So to begin customizing this, in the parameters I'm able to control all the various elements that make up the flare. The flare itself, rays, fog, various polygons and disc shapes, glows, rings, stripes, chroma fans, and so much more. Definitely experiment with the various settings, but for now, let's start by opening up the fog and let's change that color to something a bit warmer. You'll notice that it now actually adds a little bit of a color grading to the scene itself. Now when I toggle the glows parameter, you can see that there are these shapes right here. If I open the group up, I can control their brightness, color, scale, count, and spread. Let's spread them out a bit. And why don't we also turn off that faded ring? I think it's a bit much for our scene. You know, the same goes for this elliptical caustic. It's just too much in this scene. But what I want to do is let's open up Chroma Hoop, which controls this rainbow object right here. Now I can adjust the scale, the intensity, and arc completeness to change the shape and brightness. Let's bring everything down just a bit, and you know what? I want to also pull back on the density a bit. It's going to make this effect a whole lot more subtle. And you know what? While we're at it, let's go up and open up our stripe settings and adjust the color to orange, something that matches our fog. You know, we can play around a bit with the intensity and the length just until we get something that looks like an interesting flare. Now, as I said earlier, this is just an example to show you what's available inside of the LensFlare parameters. Feel free to experiment to create a unique flare, play with color grading, and really create something very different. But for this tutorial on quickly and easily using LensFlare 3D to track and obscure a lens flare, that's all there is to it. I'm Vin Morreale with Boris Effects, and for more great tutorials, don't forget to check out the Boris Effects website. Take care!